What if the giants of old, the Nephilim of ancient scripture and myth, never vanished, but simply went into hiding? What if their bloodlines, their ruins, and their influence still shape our world today, woven so deeply into the fabric of history that we mistake their fingerprints for our own achievements? What if the stories we were told as children, the myths we dismissed as primitive fantasy, were actually warnings, echoes of a truth so vast and so unsettling that entire civilizations chose to bury it rather than face what it meant? Tonight, we descend into that buried truth. We walk through the ruins they left behind, trace the bloodlines that may still flow through human veins, and ask the question that haunts every ancient text. Did the Nephilim truly die, or did they simply learn to hide? The Ancient Whisper. The story begins in the oldest pages of human memory, in texts so ancient that their authors are lost to time. In the book of Genesis, buried within the genealogies and flood narratives, there exists a passage that has troubled scholars and theologians for millennia. It appears suddenly, without explanation, as though the writer assumed the reader already knew what it meant. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of the old, men of renown. 4 lines, that's all we're given. 4 lines to describe beings so significant that their existence warranted mention in humanity's most sacred text, yet so troubling that no further explanation was offered. The Hebrew word Nephilim itself remains contested. Some translate it as fallen ones, others as those who cause others to fall. The root suggests descent, a falling from grace or from the heavens themselves. But who were they? And why does the text mention them so briefly, as though speaking their name too loudly might summon something best left forgotten? The Book of Enoch, excluded from most biblical canons but preserved by Ethiopian Christians and discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, offers a more complete and more disturbing account. According to Enoch, 200 angels called Watchers descended to Mount Hermon, drawn by the beauty of human women. They took an oath together, binding themselves to a forbidden act, knowing the consequences would be catastrophic. They taught humanity secrets meant only for the divine, the arts of war, the making of weapons, the knowledge of cosmetics and seduction, the movements of the stars and the cutting of roots for sorcery. And they fathered children. These children were the Nephilim, beings of immense size and terrible appetite. Enoch describes them as giants who consumed all the resources of humanity, and when these resources ran out, they turned on humans themselves. They were neither fully divine nor fully human, existing in a liminal space that violated the natural order. They were abominations, according to the text, and their presence on earth corrupted everything they touched. The flood in this telling was not merely punishment for human wickedness. It was an act of cosmic necessity, a cleansing of a world so polluted by hybrid beings that it could no longer sustain life as God intended. The waters rose to erase them, to drown the giants and wash away the stain of their existence. But the text says something else, something easy to miss in the rush of the flood narrative. It says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, after the flood, after the cleansing, after the world was supposedly purified and given a fresh start through Noah and his family. The Nephilim, or beings like them, returned, or perhaps they never truly left. The names they were given. Every culture on earth has stories of giants. Not metaphorical giants, not heroes whose deeds were exaggerated by time, but literal beings of enormous stature who walked the earth before recorded history began. The consistency of these accounts, separated by oceans and millennia, suggests something more than coincidence. In the lands of Canaan, the Israelites encountered the Anakim, a race of giants so fearsome that the spies Moses sent into the Promised Land returned trembling. "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes," they reported, "and we looked the same to them." The Anakim were said to be descendants of the Nephilim, survivors of the flood who had rebuilt their civilization in the hills and valleys of what would become Israel. Their cities were fortified with walls so high and thick that ordinary armies despaired of ever breaching them. King Og of Bashan, mentioned in Deuteronomy, slept in a bed of iron that measured 13 feet long. The text presents this as historical fact, not legend. His kingdom was one of the last strongholds of the Rephaim, another race of giants whose name means the dead ones, or the shades, beings who existed between life and death, between the human and the divine. Goliath of Gath, the champion who faced David, stood over 9 feet tall according to most translations, though some ancient texts suggest he was even larger. He was not an anomaly. He came from a family of giants, and the Philistine cities were known to harbour bloodlines that traced back to the Anakim. When David killed Goliath, he didn't slay the last giant. He merely defeated one warrior from a race that had been fighting humanity for generations. But the stories don't end in the Middle East. In Greek mythology, the Titans were primordial giants who ruled before the Olympian gods, beings of such power that it took a cosmic war to overthrow them. Even after their defeat, they were not destroyed but imprisoned in Tartarus, deep beneath the earth, where they wait in chains. The Greeks spoke of the Gigantes as well, giants born from the blood of Uranus, who waged war against the gods themselves. In Norse mythology, the Jötnar, often translated as giants, were the ancient enemies of the gods, beings who existed before creation and who will return at Ragnarök to burn the world. They lived in Jotunheim, a realm separate from the world of humans and gods, but they frequently crossed into Midgard, interbreeding with humans and gods alike. Loki himself was half Jotun, a hybrid being whose very existence blurred the boundaries between the divine and the monstrous. The Nephilim, the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Titans, the Jötnar, different names in different languages, but the pattern remains the same. Beings of great size and power, born from the union of the divine and the mortal, who once ruled the earth and who were eventually overthrown or driven into hiding. Beings who left behind ruins too massive for ordinary humans to have built, and legends too consistent to be dismissed as mere fantasy. What if these weren't separate myths? What if they were all memories of the same ancient truth, preserved in different cultures, each one remembering the giants in their own way? The ruins that remain. If the Nephilim existed, they would have left evidence, not just in texts and legends, but in stone, in structures so massive and so precisely constructed that even modern engineers struggle to explain how they were built. And when we look at the ancient world with fresh eyes, we find exactly that. Ruins that whisper of builders who were not quite human. Baalbek in modern-day Lebanon contains some of the largest stone blocks ever used in construction. The Temple of Jupiter sits atop a foundation of megalithic stones, 3 of which, known as the Trilithon, weigh approximately 800 tons each. They were quarried from a site nearly a mile away, transported across uneven terrain, and lifted into place with such precision that a knife blade cannot fit between them. 800 tons. To put that in perspective, the largest stones used in the Great Pyramid of Giza weigh about 15 tons. The stones at Stonehenge weigh around 25 tons. The trilithon stones are more than 30 times heavier than those, and they were placed not at ground level but elevated, fitted into a wall with mathematical precision. Mainstream archaeology attributes Baalbek to the Romans, and indeed, the Temple of Jupiter is Roman. But the foundation beneath it is far older, built in a style that predates Roman engineering by centuries, possibly millennia. The Romans themselves seem to recognize this. They built their temple on top of an existing platform, as though they knew the foundation was too sacred or too ancient to disturb. Local legend tells a different story. The people of the region have always called Baalbek the Fortress of the Giants, claiming it was built by beings of enormous size in the time before the flood. Arab historians writing in the medieval period recorded these traditions, describing how the giants constructed the platform as a refuge, a place to survive the coming deluge. Could ordinary humans have moved those stones? Perhaps with enough time, enough labour, and enough ingenuity. But the question isn't whether it's possible. It's why anyone would choose to work with stones so impossibly large when smaller blocks would have been far easier to quarry, transport and place. Unless, of course, the builders were strong enough that 800-ton stones weren't impossibly large at all. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey pushes the timeline even further back. Discovered in the 1990s, this megalithic site dates to approximately 9600 BCE, making it older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years, older than the pyramids by 7,000 years. It predates agriculture, predates pottery, predates everything we thought we knew about the development of human civilization. The site consists of massive T-shaped pillars arranged in circles, some weighing up to 20 tons, carved with intricate reliefs of animals and abstract symbols. The level of organization required to construct Göbekli Tepe suggests a sophisticated society with specialized labor, yet it was built by people who were supposedly hunter-gatherers, living in small nomadic bands. Or were they? The carvings at Göbekli Tepe include strange humanoid figures, beings with elongated heads and exaggerated features, depicted alongside animals and geometric patterns. Some researchers have noted that these figures don't quite look human, that their proportions are off in ways that suggest the artists were depicting something other than themselves. The site was deliberately buried around 8000 BCE, not abandoned, buried. Someone went to enormous effort to fill in the circles with debris, preserving the pillars beneath tons of earth. Why would a society invest so much labour in building something, only to bury it 1,000 years later? Unless they were hiding it. Unless they wanted to ensure that whatever happened at Göbekli Tepe, whatever knowledge or power it represented, would be forgotten. In Peru, the elongated skulls of Paracas have puzzled researchers for decades. These are not the result of cranial binding, a practice used by many ancient cultures to reshape the skull for aesthetic or ritual purposes. The Paracas skulls are different. They have greater cranial volume than normal human skulls, different bone structure, and in some cases genetic anomalies that don't match any known human population. DNA analysis conducted on some of these skulls revealed mitochondrial DNA with mutations unknown in any human, primate, or animal. The results were so unusual that the researchers struggled to classify them. Were these humans with rare genetic disorders? Or were they something else? Hybrids, perhaps, carrying genetic material from a non-human source. The Paracas culture revered these individuals, burying them with great honour in elaborate tombs. They were clearly important, possibly rulers or priests. And they were not alone. Elongated skulls have been found in Egypt, Malta, Iraq, and other sites around the world, always associated with elite burials, always treated as special. What if these weren't deformities or cultural practices? What if they were the last remnants of the Nephilim bloodline, individuals who carried just enough giant ancestry to manifest physical differences, who were revered precisely because they were descendants of the old ones, the bloodlines that survived? If the Nephilim existed, and if some survived the flood or were reborn afterward, then their bloodline would have continued. Diluted, perhaps, mixed with human genetics over countless generations, but still present, still carrying traces of something ancient and powerful. The Bible itself suggests this. After the flood, when the Israelites entered Canaan, they encountered the Anakim giants who were explicitly described as descendants of the Nephilim. This means the Nephilim bloodline survived the deluge, either because some giants escaped the waters, or because their genetic legacy persisted through Noah's family. That second possibility is more disturbing than the first. If the Nephilim genes survived through Noah's line, it means the flood didn't cleanse the world of hybrid DNA. It merely reduced it. It means every human alive today could potentially carry fragments of that ancient bloodline, dormant sequences waiting for the right conditions to express themselves. Ancient royal families seem to understand this. Across cultures, kings and queens obsessed over bloodlines, marrying within their own families to preserve purity, claiming descent from gods or heroes. The pharaohs of Egypt practiced sibling marriage for generations, believing their blood was divine and must not be diluted with common human stock. The royal families of Mesopotamia traced their lineage back to the Anunnaki, beings who descended from the heavens and ruled as god-kings. Were they trying to preserve something? Were they attempting to maintain a genetic connection to the Nephilim, to keep alive whatever gifts or powers that bloodline conferred? The Book of Jubilees, another ancient Jewish text, describes how Noah's grandson Canaan was cursed specifically because he carried the blood of the Watchers. The curse wasn't metaphorical, it was genetic, a contamination that would pass to his descendants and mark them as enemies of God's chosen people. The Canaanites, according to this tradition, were literally the children of fallen angels, and their destruction was necessary to prevent the Nephilim bloodline from spreading. But it did spread. The Canaanites intermarried with surrounding peoples. The Philistines, the Phoenicians, the various tribes of the ancient Near East, all of them carried some mixture of that ancient blood. And as empires rose and fell, as populations migrated and mixed, that genetic legacy dispersed across the world. In medieval Europe, certain noble families claimed descent from Meravesh, a semi-legendary Frankish king said to be born from the union of his mother and a sea creature. The Merovingian dynasty that ruled France traced their legitimacy to this hybrid origin, believing their blood gave them a divine right to rule. When the Merovingians were overthrown, their bloodline didn't disappear. It went underground, preserved by secret societies and occult orders who believed the royal blood carried mystical properties. The Templars, the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, all of these organizations at various points in history have been accused of preserving ancient bloodlines, of protecting genetic legacies that trace back to pre-flood times. Conspiracy theories suggest they guard the descendants of the Nephilim, waiting for the day when that bloodline can be restored to power. Are these theories true? Perhaps not in the literal sense, but they point to something deeper, a persistent belief across cultures and centuries that some humans are different, that some carry the blood of beings who are more than human, and that this difference matters. Modern genetics has revealed something fascinating. Humans carry DNA from species we didn't even know existed until recently. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and possibly other archaic hominids contributed to our genome through interbreeding. We are, quite literally, hybrids, mixtures of different human species that evolved separately and then merged. What if there were other contributors to our genome? What if the Nephilim weren't a separate species but a genetic experiment, a deliberate hybridization of human and something else? Something we don't have a name for because it no longer exists in pure form. What if that's why the flood was necessary? Not to punish humanity, but to reset the genetic experiment before it spiraled completely out of control. The structures that defy explanation. The pyramids of Giza have stood for more than 4,000 years, and despite centuries of study, we still don't fully understand how they were built. The Great Pyramid contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing between 2 and 15 tons, fitted together with such precision that the entire structure is aligned to true north within a fraction of a degree. The mainstream explanation involves ramps, copper tools, and thousands of workers labouring for decades. And perhaps that's true. Perhaps ordinary humans with enough determination and ingenuity could have accomplished this feat. But there are details that don't quite fit. The granite blocks in the king's chamber were quarried from Aswan, 500 miles away. Some of these blocks weigh up to 80 tons. They were transported down the Nile, then dragged across the desert, then lifted more than 200 feet into the air and manoeuvred through narrow passages into the heart of the pyramid. The precision required to place these blocks is extraordinary. The gaps between them are so small that a human hair barely fits. Why granite? Why transport stones from 500 miles away when perfectly good limestone was available locally? Unless the builders needed granite for a specific purpose, unless they understood properties of stone that we've only recently rediscovered. Some researchers have noted that the Great Pyramid sits at the exact centre of the Earth's landmass, that its dimensions encode mathematical constants like pi and phi, that its internal passages align with specific stars in ways that suggest advanced astronomical knowledge. Mainstream archaeology dismisses these observations as coincidence or numerology, but the patterns are there, undeniable and precise. The Sphinx, weathered and enigmatic, may be even older than the pyramids. Geologists examining the erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure have suggested that the weathering is consistent with water erosion, not wind erosion. But the Sahara has been a desert for thousands of years. The last time the region experienced rainfall heavy enough to cause that kind of erosion was before 5000 BCE, possibly as far back as 10,000 BCE. If the Sphinx is that old, it predates Egyptian civilization entirely. It would have been built by whoever lived in the Nile Valley before the pharaohs, before the pyramids, before recorded history. And if they could carve a monument that size from solid bedrock, what else were they capable of? Across the Atlantic, the ruins of Tiwanaku in Bolivia present similar mysteries. This ancient city sits at an altitude of more than 12,000 feet, in an environment so harsh that modern humans struggle to work there for extended periods. Yet someone built a massive ceremonial complex, complete with precisely cut stone blocks weighing up to 100 tons, fitted together with metal clamps. The Gateway of the Sun, carved from a single block of andesite weighing approximately 10 tons, features intricate reliefs that some researchers believe represent a calendar system more sophisticated than anything the Inca possessed. The figure at the centre of the gateway holds staffs and wears a headdress with radiating lines, a being of power, possibly divine, possibly something else. Local legend says Tiwanaku was built by giants in a single night, before the flood, as a city for the gods. The Aymara people who live in the region today still tell stories of the ancient ones, beings of great size who could move stones with their minds, who built the city as a gateway between worlds. Mainstream archaeology dates Tiwanaku to around 500 CE, but some researchers argue the site is far older, that the structures attributed to the Tiwanaku culture were actually built on top of ruins from a previous civilization. The precision of the stonework, the astronomical alignments, the sheer scale of the construction, all of it suggests knowledge and capabilities that don't fit the timeline we've been given. On Easter Island, the Moai statues stand as silent witnesses to a vanished culture. Nearly 900 of these massive stone figures dot the island, some weighing up to 80 tons, carved from volcanic rock, and transported across the island to platforms where they were erected to face inland, watching over the people. The islanders say their ancestors carved the Moai, but they've lost the knowledge of how it was done. The statues were walked into place, according to legend, moved by mana, spiritual power, rather than physical force. Modern experiments have shown that the statues can be moved using ropes and coordinated rocking, but the largest Moai still in the quarry weighs more than 200 tons. No amount of rope and rocking would move that. What if the legends are true? What if the Moai were carved and moved by people who possessed abilities we've lost, who carried genetic traits that gave them strength or knowledge beyond what modern humans possess? What if Easter Island was one of the last refugees of the Nephilim bloodline, and the Moai were carved in their image, tall, imposing, with elongated features that don't quite look human? The forbidden knowledge. The Book of Enoch describes in detail what the Watchers taught humanity. These weren't benign gifts. They were dangerous secrets, knowledge that corrupted and destroyed. Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and armor, transforming humanity from peaceful gatherers into warriors. Semjaza taught enchantments and root-cutting, the foundations of sorcery. Amaros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabel taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of clouds. Arakiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. And Sariel taught the course of the moon. These teachings sound almost like a curriculum, a deliberate program of education designed to elevate humanity from ignorance to knowledge, but the text frames them as corruption, as violations of the natural order. Why? Perhaps because knowledge, in the wrong hands or at the wrong time, is dangerous. Perhaps because humanity wasn't ready for these secrets, and receiving them prematurely led to catastrophe. Or perhaps because the knowledge itself was tainted, carrying with it the seeds of destruction. Ancient cultures around the world speak of a time when gods walked among humans and taught them the arts of civilization. The Sumerians credited the Anunnaki with teaching them writing, mathematics, agriculture, and law. The Egyptians said Thoth gave them hieroglyphs and sacred geometry. The Greeks attributed their knowledge to Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity, suffering eternal punishment for his transgression. These stories follow the same pattern as the Watcher's narrative. Divine beings descending to earth, sharing forbidden knowledge, and facing consequences for their actions. What if they're all describing the same event, the same transfer of knowledge from the Nephilim to humanity? The antediluvian patriarchs, the men who lived before the flood, are described in Genesis as living for hundreds of years. Methuselah lived 969 years. Noah was 600 years old when the flood came. These lifespans seem impossible, but what if they're not exaggerations? What if the Nephilim bloodline conferred longevity, and the patriarchs lived so long because they carried genetic traits from the giants? After the flood, human lifespans drop dramatically. Noah's descendants live for only a few hundred years, and within a few generations the lifespan settles at the familiar 70 or 80 years. Something changed. The genetic legacy of the Nephilim was diluted, and with it, the extended lifespans disappeared. But the knowledge remained. The survivors of the flood carried with them the teachings of the Watchers, the secrets of metallurgy and astronomy and agriculture. They rebuilt civilization using that knowledge, constructing cities and temples and monuments that echoed the achievements of the pre-flood world. And perhaps they carried something else. Texts, artifacts, physical remnants of the Nephilim era that were too valuable or too dangerous to destroy. The Book of Enoch itself claims to be based on visions given to Enoch before the flood, preserved through the deluge and passed down through generations. If that text survived, what else might have? Mystery schools and secret societies throughout history have claimed to possess ancient wisdom, knowledge passed down from before the flood. The Egyptian priesthood guarded their mysteries jealously, initiating only a select few into the deeper teachings. The Pythagoreans in Greece practiced secrecy, believing that certain mathematical and philosophical truths were too powerful for the uninitiated. The Gnostics spoke of hidden knowledge that could liberate the soul from the material world. Were they preserving fragments of what the Watchers taught? Were they the inheritors of Nephilim wisdom, keeping it alive through the centuries, waiting for the time when humanity would be ready to receive it again? In the medieval period, alchemists sought the philosopher's stone, a substance that could transmute lead into gold and grant eternal life. Their writings are filled with obscure symbols and coded language, but beneath the mysticism, they were conducting real experiments, discovering real chemistry. Some historians believe alchemy was a cover for something deeper, a search for the secrets of the Nephilim, an attempt to recreate the longevity and power that the giants possessed. The Renaissance saw an explosion of interest in ancient texts, particularly those that had been suppressed or forgotten. Scholars scoured monasteries and libraries, seeking manuscripts that predated Christianity, hoping to recover the wisdom of the ancient world. They found Hermetic texts, Neoplatonic philosophy, Jewish mysticism, all of it pointing back to a time when humanity possessed knowledge that was later lost or hidden. What if that knowledge was never truly lost? What if it's been preserved all along, guarded by those who understand its power and its danger, waiting for the moment when it can be revealed without destroying the world? The modern search. In the 20th century, something changed. Governments and military organizations began taking ancient mysteries seriously, funding expeditions to remote sites, searching for artifacts and texts that might contain lost knowledge. The Nazis were obsessed with the occult, sending teams to Tibet, South America, and the Middle East in search of relics that could give them power. They believed in the existence of a master race, a bloodline superior to ordinary humans, and they sought evidence of that bloodline in ancient ruins and forgotten texts. After World War II, the United States and Soviet Union continued this search, though more quietly. Operation Paperclip brought Nazi scientists to America, and with them came their research into ancient mysteries. The CIA conducted experiments in remote viewing, attempting to access information through psychic means, exploring the boundaries of human consciousness in ways that echoed the teachings of the mystery schools. In 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in caves near Qumran, containing copies of biblical texts and previously unknown writings, including multiple copies of the Book of Enoch. The scrolls confirmed that the Nephilim narrative was taken seriously by ancient Jewish communities, that it wasn't just mythology but part of their historical understanding. Why were these texts hidden in caves? The standard explanation is that the Essenes, a Jewish sect, stored them there for safekeeping during the Roman occupation. But what if they were hidden for a different reason? What if the knowledge contained in those scrolls was considered too dangerous to circulate freely, and the caves were chosen specifically because they would preserve the texts while keeping them out of reach? In recent decades, advances in genetics have opened new possibilities. The Human Genome Project mapped our DNA, revealing that humans share genetic material with species we didn't know existed. We carry Neanderthal DNA, Denisovan DNA, and possibly DNA from other archaic hominids that haven't been identified yet. Some researchers have begun asking uncomfortable questions. What if there are genetic sequences in human DNA that don't match any known species? What if there are genes that appear to have been inserted rather than inherited through natural evolution? What if the Nephilim left their mark not just in stone and legend, but in our very cells? There are rumours, unconfirmed, impossible to verify, of secret genetic research programs attempting to isolate and activate ancient DNA sequences. The goal, according to these rumours, is to recreate the abilities that the Nephilim possessed, to produce humans with enhanced strength, intelligence, or longevity. Whether these programs exist or not, the fact that people believe they exist says something about our collective fascination with the idea of transcending human limitations. Transhumanism, the movement to enhance human capabilities through technology, echoes the Nephilim narrative in disturbing ways. The goal is to create beings that are more than human, to merge biological and artificial intelligence, to extend lifespan indefinitely, to augment physical and mental abilities beyond natural limits. It's the same impulse that drove the Watchers to descend and teach humanity forbidden knowledge, the desire to transcend boundaries, to become something greater. But the Book of Enoch warns that this path leads to destruction. The Nephilim, for all their power, were abominations that had to be destroyed. Their existence corrupted the world so thoroughly that only a flood could cleanse it. If we're following the same path, if we're attempting to recreate what they were, are we heading toward the same fate? The hidden ones. What if the Nephilim didn't die? What if they simply learned to hide? Throughout history there have been reports of giants in remote regions, beings of enormous size living in mountains, forests and deserts far from human civilization. Native American tribes speak of the Site-Ka, red-haired giants who lived in caves and waged war against the ancestors. The Paiute people of Nevada tell stories of hunting these giants to extinction, trapping them in a cave and setting it on fire. When archaeologists excavated Lovelock Cave in 1911, they found remains of individuals significantly taller than average, along with artifacts that suggested a culture distinct from the surrounding tribes. In the Caucasus Mountains, legends speak of the Almas, large humanoid creatures that live in the high peaks, avoiding contact with humans. Descriptions vary, but they're consistently described as taller and more robust than ordinary humans, covered in hair, with elongated skulls and powerful builds. Similar creatures appear in legends from the Himalayas, the Pacific Northwest, the Amazon, always in remote regions, always described as avoiding human contact. Are these just myths? Misidentifications of bears or other animals? Or are they remnants of the Nephilim, survivors who retreated to the edges of the world when humanity became too numerous and too dangerous? The ocean covers more than 70% of the Earth's surface, and we've explored less than 5% of it. The deep sea is the largest habitat on Earth, and it's almost entirely unknown. What lives down there, in the trenches and abyssal plains where no light penetrates? Could the Nephilim have retreated beneath the waves, building cities in the depth where humans couldn't follow? Ancient texts speak of beings who lived in the sea. The Babylonian god Oannes was described as a fishman who emerged from the Persian Gulf to teach humanity the arts of civilization. The Philistine god Dagon was depicted as half man, half fish. The Greek Tritons were sea-dwelling hybrids, children of Poseidon. What if these weren't gods but Nephilim who adapted to aquatic life, who found refuge in the ocean when the land became too hostile? There are reports, mostly dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, of massive humanoid figures seen in deep water. Divers have described encounters with beings far larger than any known marine animal, with vaguely human features, watching from the darkness before disappearing into the depths. Sonar has detected anomalies, large objects moving in patterns that don't match any known sea creature, sometimes at depths where the pressure should crush any living thing. Could the Nephilim have survived by going underground? The Earth's crust is riddled with caves and tunnels, some natural, some possibly artificial. Ancient texts speak of underworld realms, Sheol, Hades, the Duat, places beneath the earth where the dead dwell. But what if these weren't metaphorical? What if there are vast caverns deep underground, ecosystems that exist independently of the surface, where beings could live for millennia without ever being seen? In the 1940s, Admiral Richard Byrd led expeditions to Antarctica and allegedly discovered entrances to underground realms. His reports, if they're genuine, describe vast caverns with their own climate, vegetation and inhabitants, beings that didn't match any known species. The reports were classified, and Byrd's later statements about his discoveries were vague and contradictory, leading to speculation that he'd been ordered to remain silent about what he'd found. Antarctica is the least explored continent, covered in ice miles thick, with mountain ranges and valleys that have never been seen by human eyes. If the Nephilim wanted to hide, if they needed a place where humans wouldn't follow, Antarctica would be ideal. The ice would preserve their cities, protect them from discovery, and the extreme environment would deter all but the most determined explorers. What if they're still there? What if beneath the ice, in caverns warmed by geothermal heat, the descendants of the Nephilim wait, preserving their knowledge and their bloodline, watching the surface world through means we can't detect, waiting for the time when they can emerge again. The return. Every major religion speaks of an end time, a period when the world as we know it will end and something new will begin. In Christianity, the book of Revelation describes the return of Christ, the final battle between good and evil, and the establishment of a new heaven and new earth. In Islam, the Day of Judgment will see the resurrection of the dead and the final accounting of souls. In Hinduism, the current age of Kali Yuga will end in destruction, followed by renewal. In Norse mythology, Ragnarök will see the gods and giants wage their final war, burning the world before it's reborn. These prophecies differ in details, but they share common elements. A time of tribulation, the return of ancient powers, a final conflict, and transformation. What if these prophecies are describing the same event? What if they're all warning about the return of the Nephilim? The Book of Enoch describes the punishment of the Watchers. They were bound in chains and imprisoned in darkness until the day of judgment, not destroyed, but imprisoned, waiting. The text suggests that at the end of days they will be released to face final judgment, and their release will coincide with a period of great tribulation on earth. What if that release is coming? What if the Nephilim, whether imprisoned in the earth or hidden in remote regions, are preparing to return? What if the signs are already here and we're too distracted to notice? UFO sightings have increased dramatically in recent decades. The US government has acknowledged that unidentified aerial phenomena exist, that military pilots have encountered objects that defy known physics, moving in ways that no human technology can replicate. The standard explanation is extraterrestrial visitors, but what if the truth is stranger? What if these aren't aliens from other planets, but Nephilim emerging from hidden bases, testing their technology, preparing for something? Ancient astronaut theories suggest that gods and angels were actually advanced beings from other worlds, that the miracles and wonders described in religious texts were misunderstood technology. But what if it's the reverse? What if the beings we're seeing now, the UFOs and their occupants, aren't aliens but the same entities that ancient texts called Watchers and Nephilim? What if they never left Earth, and what we're witnessing is their gradual return to visibility? There are reports of increased activity at ancient sites, strange lights seen over the pyramids, unusual electromagnetic readings at Stonehenge, unexplained phenomena at Göbekli Tepe. Mainstream science dismisses these as hoaxes or natural phenomena, but the reports persist, coming from credible witnesses, documented with photographs and sensor data. What if these sites are awakening? What if they were never just monuments but machines? Devices built by the Nephilim for purposes we don't understand, and they're being reactivated. What if the return has already begun, and we're watching it happen without recognizing what we're seeing? The genetic research mentioned earlier, the attempts to map and manipulate human DNA, could be part of this. What if the Nephilim are guiding this research, using human scientists to prepare the way for their return? What if the goal is to create a new generation of hybrids, beings that carry Nephilim genetics but are born into the modern world, ready to serve as a bridge between the old ones and humanity? Conspiracy theories suggest that certain bloodlines have been preserved through history, that royal families and secret societies have maintained genetic purity specifically to ensure that when the Nephilim return, there will be humans ready to serve them, humans who carry enough of the ancient blood to be compatible with the old ones. Are these theories true? It's impossible to say, but they point to a deep unease, a sense that something is coming, that the world is changing in ways we don't fully understand, and that the changes are connected to something ancient and powerful. The question that remains. So we return to where we began, to the question that has haunted humanity since the first stories were told around fires in the darkness. What if the Nephilim never died? What if they're still here, hidden in the depths of the ocean, beneath the ice of Antarctica, in caverns deep underground, or walking among us in forms we don't recognize? What if the ruins they left behind aren't just monuments to a vanished past, but markers, beacons, devices waiting to be activated? What if the bloodlines that trace back to them aren't just genetic curiosities, but preparations for something yet to come? The evidence is fragmentary, the theories speculative, the conclusions uncertain, but the pattern is there, woven through every culture, every ancient text, every unexplained ruin. Beings of great size and power once walked the earth. They taught humanity forbidden knowledge. They interbred with humans, creating hybrid offspring. They were overthrown or driven into hiding, but they didn't disappear completely. Their legacy remains in our DNA, in the stones they moved, in the stories we tell, and perhaps in something more, in the feeling that we're not alone, that we're being watched, that something ancient and powerful is waiting for the right moment to return. The flood was meant to cleanse the world, to erase the Nephilim and give humanity a fresh start. But the text says they returned afterward. They survived, or they were reborn, and they've been with us ever since, hidden but never truly gone. What does it mean to be human if we carry their blood? What does it mean for our future if they're preparing to return? These aren't questions with easy answers. They're questions that force us to reconsider everything we think we know about our past, our present, and our future. Maybe the Nephilim era never ended. Maybe it just went underground, waiting for the time when humanity would be ready to face the truth. Or maybe it's waiting for the time when humanity would be weak enough, distracted enough, divided enough that the old ones could return without resistance. The ancient texts warn us, the ruins remind us, the legends whisper to us across the centuries. But we've forgotten how to listen. We've dismissed the warnings as primitive superstition, the ruins as impressive but explainable, the legends as entertaining but meaningless. What if we're wrong? What if the ancients knew something we've forgotten? What if they left us warnings encoded in stone and story, hoping that someday we'd remember, that we'd recognize the signs and prepare for what's coming? The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. That single phrase, easy to overlook, changes everything. It means the story didn't end with the flood. It means the giants survived in some form, and their presence continued to shape human history. Are they still shaping it? Are they still here, working behind the scenes, guiding events towards some purpose we can't see? Or are they waiting, dormant but not dead, for the moment when they can emerge again and reclaim the world they once ruled? We build our cities on the ruins of theirs. We carry their blood in our veins. We tell their stories without understanding what they mean. And perhaps, in the quiet moments, in the spaces between sleep and waking, we sense them. The old ones, the giants, the Nephilim, watching from the shadows, waiting for their time to return. The question isn't whether they existed. The evidence suggests they did in some form, whether as literal giants or as something else that ancient peoples interpreted as giants. The question is whether they're gone. And if the texts are right, if the legends are true, if the patterns we see in ruins and bloodlines and modern mysteries all point to the same conclusion, then the answer is no. They're not gone. They never left. They're here, hidden in plain sight, woven into the fabric of our world so deeply that we mistake their influence for our own achievements. And maybe, just maybe, they're preparing to reveal themselves again. What happens then? What happens when the Nephilim return? When the old ones emerge from their hiding places and reclaim their place in the world? Will it be the end of humanity as we know it, or the beginning of something new? Will we be destroyed or transformed? Will we fight or will we submit? The ancient texts don't give us clear answers. They warn us, they prepare us, but they don't tell us how the story ends. Maybe that's because the ending hasn't been written yet. Maybe it depends on us, on whether we remember the warnings, whether we recognize the signs, whether we're ready when the moment comes. Or maybe the ending was written long ago, in the time before the flood, and we're just living out the final chapters of a story that began when the Watchers first descended to Mount Hermon and looked upon the daughters of men and found them beautiful. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. The story continues, the bloodline persists, the ruins remain, and somewhere, In the depths of the ocean or beneath the ice or in caverns deep underground, the Old Ones wait. They've always been patient. They've had thousands of years to perfect their patience. And when they return, if they return, the world will remember what it forgot. The world will understand what the ancients tried to tell us, that we were never alone, that we were never fully human, that we carry within us the legacy of beings who are more than human, and that legacy shapes everything we are and everything we might become. The Nephilim era never died. It just learned to hide. And now perhaps it's learning to emerge again. The watchers who never stopped watching. If the Nephilim survived, they would need a system, a way to monitor humanity, to track our development, to ensure we never grew strong enough or unified enough to threaten them. They would need eyes in every civilization, agents in positions of power, mechanisms to guide human history along paths that served their purposes. They would need, in essence, to become the invisible hand that shapes empires. History is filled with shadowy figures who appear at crucial moments, offering knowledge or resources that change the course of civilizations, advisors to kings whose origins are obscure, priests who seem to possess knowledge beyond their time, merchants who arrive with technologies that shouldn't exist yet. We dismiss these as legends, as embellishments added by chroniclers who wanted to make their stories more interesting. But what if some of them were real? In ancient Sumer, the texts speak of the Apkallu, 7 sages who appeared before the flood, sent by the god Enki to teach humanity the arts of civilization. They're depicted in carvings as strange hybrid creatures, sometimes human-headed fish, sometimes beings with wings and animal features. They taught kingship, temple building, mathematics, and the proper worship of the gods. Then, after the flood, they disappeared from the historical record, or rather, they continued but in different forms, as human sages who carried on the teaching traditions. The transition is telling. The pre-flood Apkallu were openly non-human, hybrid beings who walked among humans without disguise. The post-flood sages were human, or at least they appeared human. What changed? Perhaps after the flood, after humanity had proven itself capable of recognizing and fearing the Nephilim, the survivors learned that survival required camouflage. In Egypt, the priesthood of Heliopolis claimed to possess knowledge that stretched back to Zep-Tepi, the first time, an era when gods walked the earth and established the foundations of Egyptian civilization. This knowledge was never written down in its entirety. It was passed orally from one generation of priests to the next, shared only with initiates who had proven themselves worthy. What were they preserving? What secrets were so dangerous that they couldn't be committed to writing? The Egyptian concept of the Aku, the transfigured spirits, describes beings who have transcended normal human existence, who possess knowledge and powers that ordinary humans lack. These weren't gods in the distant heavens, but beings who could interact with the physical world, who could appear to humans and influence events. The pharaohs underwent rituals designed to transform them into Aku, to give them access to this elevated state. Were these rituals symbolic, or were they attempts to activate dormant Nephilim genetics, to awaken whatever traces of giant blood ran through royal veins? In Greece, the mystery schools of Eleusis, Samothrace, and Delphi initiated thousands of people over centuries into secret knowledge. Participants in the Eleusinian mysteries experienced visions, encounters with divine beings, revelations about the nature of reality, transformative experiences that they were forbidden to discuss with outsiders. Scholars have speculated about what actually happened in those ceremonies. Was it simply religious theatre, or were participants exposed to something real? Substances, rituals, or even contact with non-human entities that produced genuine mystical experiences. Plato wrote about Atlantis, describing it as advanced civilization that existed before recorded history, that possessed technology and knowledge far beyond what ancient Greece had achieved, and that was ultimately destroyed for its hubris. He claimed to have received the story through a chain of transmission that traced back to Egyptian priests, who had preserved records of the antediluvian world. Most scholars treat Atlantis as Plato's invention, a philosophical thought experiment. But what if he was relating an actual tradition, a memory preserved by those who knew that human civilization was not the first, that something came before? The pattern repeats across cultures and centuries. Secret knowledge preserved by hidden groups, initiations that transform participants, claims of contact with non-human intelligence, bloodlines that carry special significance, technologies or insights that appear fully formed without the gradual development we'd expect from human innovation. What if these weren't separate phenomena but parts of a single system, a network of influence maintained by Nephilim survivors or their hybrid descendants, ensuring that humanity developed along specific paths, that certain knowledge was preserved while other knowledge was suppressed, that bloodlines were protected and power remained in the hands of those who served the old ones? The architecture of control doesn't require direct rule. The most effective control is invisible, operating through systems so ubiquitous that people don't recognize them as control at all. If the Nephilim wanted to guide humanity without revealing themselves, they would need to embed their influence in the fundamental structures of civilization, in how we organize ourselves, how we understand reality, how we pass knowledge from generation to generation. Consider language itself. Why do humans speak thousands of different languages? The Tower of Babel story offers an explanation. God confused human language to prevent humanity from unifying and becoming too powerful. But what if the story is describing something that actually happened? What if linguistic diversity was deliberately engineered, not by God, but by those who wanted to keep humanity divided? Linguists have identified language families, groups of related languages that evolve from common ancestors. But there are languages that don't fit into any family isolates that seem to have no relatives, no clear origin point. Basque in Europe, Sumerian in the Middle East, Ainu in Japan, languages that appear suddenly in the historical record, fully formed, with no evident ancestral languages. How does a language appear from nowhere, unless it was introduced from outside, taught by those who already possessed it? The structure of language shapes how we think. Studies have shown that speakers of different languages literally perceive reality differently, that the grammar and vocabulary available to us determines what concepts we can easily express, and therefore what thoughts we naturally have. If you wanted to limit human consciousness, to prevent certain kinds of thinking or realization, manipulating language would be one of the most effective methods. Give humans the words for things you want them to focus on, withhold words for things you want them to ignore. Mathematics is called the universal language, but even mathematics has embedded assumptions. We use base 10 counting systems because we have 10 fingers, but ancient cultures used base 60, Mesopotamia, and base 20, Mayan. The choice of base affects what calculations are easy or difficult, what patterns become visible or remain hidden. The Babylonians, working in base 60, discovered mathematical relationships that weren't rediscovered in the West until the 20th century. What if Base 60 wasn't their invention, but something taught to them, a gift from the Apkallu that encoded certain truths in its very structure? Sacred geometry, the mathematical relationships embedded in temple architecture, religious art and ceremonial spaces, appears in cultures that supposedly had no contact. The golden ratio, phi, appears in the Parthenon, in Gothic cathedrals, in Islamic mosques, in Hindu temples. The Vesica Piscis, the flower of life, the Platonic solids. These geometric forms recur across time and geography with such consistency that their independent discovery strains credibility. What if these weren't independently discovered but taught? What if the Nephilim, possessing knowledge of mathematics and geometry that humanity wouldn't rediscover for thousands of years, shared just enough to allow humans to build impressive structures that, not coincidentally, incorporated specific geometric relationships that served purposes we don't fully understand? Some researchers have noted that many ancient temples and monuments seem to function as resonance chambers, that their proportions create specific acoustic effects. The King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid resonates at a frequency that induces altered states of consciousness. Newgrange in Ireland amplifies sound in ways that suggest deliberate acoustic engineering. Göbekli Tepe's stone circles may have been designed to produce particular sonic effects. Why would ancient peoples care about acoustics? Perhaps because sound affects consciousness, because certain frequencies can induce trance states, open the mind to suggestion, or even alter physical matter. If the Nephilim wanted to maintain contact with humanity, if they needed a way to communicate or influence human consciousness without physical presence, embedding acoustic technology in sacred structures would be an elegant solution. Humans would build the temples, perform the rituals, and never realize they were operating communication devices or consciousness-altering machines. The cult of the hidden. Every major religion contains an exoteric aspect. Teachings for the masses, simple doctrines that can be understood by ordinary believers, and an esoteric aspect. Hidden teachings for initiates. Complex doctrines that reveal deeper truths. This division is universal, appearing in Christianity, Gnosticism, mysticism, Islam, Sufism, Ismailism, Judaism, Kabbalah, Buddhism, Vajrayana, Hinduism, Tantra. Why? The standard explanation is that esoteric teachings are simply more complex, requiring study and spiritual development to understand. But there's another possibility, that the esoteric teachings contain actual secrets, not just philosophical subtleties, and those secrets are too dangerous or too revealing to be shared widely. Gnostic texts suppressed by early Christianity and rediscovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945 present a radically different version of creation. In Gnostic cosmology, the material world was not created by the true God but by the demiurge, a false god, ignorant or malevolent, who trapped divine sparks in physical matter. Humanity's true origin is divine, but we've been imprisoned in flesh and deceived into worshipping our jailer. This narrative inverts the standard biblical account. The serpent in Eden becomes a hero, offering Eve knowledge that would free her from the demiurge's control. The God of the Old Testament becomes the villain, a jealous deity who demands worship while keeping humanity in ignorance. And humanity's purpose is not obedience but escape, recovering the knowledge of our true divine nature and breaking free from material existence. What if the Gnostics preserved a memory of the Nephilim era? What if the divine sparks trapped in human flesh are genetic traces of the Nephilim bloodline, fragments of something greater imprisoned in mortal bodies? What if the knowledge that liberates is literally genetic knowledge, understanding what we carry in our DNA and learning to activate it. The Gnostics were hunted down and destroyed by Orthodox Christianity. Their texts were burned, their teachers killed, their communities scattered. Why such vehemence? If Gnosticism was merely a heretical interpretation, surely debate and persuasion would have sufficed. Unless the threat wasn't theological but practical. Unless the Gnostics actually knew something, possessed actual techniques or information that threatened not just Christian doctrine, but the entire system of control that the Nephilim had established. Kabbalah, the Jewish mystical tradition, teaches that the Torah contains hidden meanings, that the text is encoded with knowledge of creation itself. Kabbalists use numerology, gematria, letter manipulation, notarikon and tamura, and meditation on sacred names to unlock these hidden teachings. They speak of the tree of life, a diagram representing emanations of divine energy, and they claim that by understanding these emanations, one can ascend through levels of reality to reach divine union. But Kabbalah also speaks of the Qliphoth, the shells, the husks, the forces of evil that mirror and oppose the tree of life. These aren't abstract philosophical concepts, but actual entities, forces that can be contacted and potentially bargained with. Medieval Kabbalists wrote extensively about angels and demons, providing names, characteristics, and rituals for summoning them. Were these real entities? And if so, what were they? The descriptions are revealing. These beings exist in a realm adjacent to ours. They possess knowledge and power beyond human capacity. They're interested in interacting with humans, and they can be bound through proper ritual. That sounds less like spirits and more like the Nephilim, beings of hybrid origin, existing between realms, possessing pre-flood knowledge, seeking ways to influence the post-flood world. Islamic esotericism speaks of the jinn, beings created from smokeless fire, existing in a realm parallel to ours, capable of taking physical form and interacting with humans. The Quran treats jinn as real entities, not metaphors. Solomon is said to have commanded jinn, using them to build his temple, a structure so magnificent that it required non-human assistance to complete. Again, the pattern appears. Non-human entities, possessing special knowledge and abilities, capable of interbreeding with humans, jinn-human hybrids appear in Islamic folklore, involved in the construction of monumental architecture. The jinn could be another cultural memory of the Nephilim, the same entities described in different terms by a different tradition, the alchemy of flesh. The medieval alchemists claim they sought to turn lead into gold, but their writings make clear that this was metaphor as much as literal goal. The great work of alchemy was transformation, not just of metals but of the alchemist himself. As above, so below wasn't just a saying, it was a principle of operation. The transformation of matter in the flask mirrored and enabled the transformation of consciousness in the practitioner. But what if there was a literal component as well? What if the alchemists really were trying to transmute flesh, to alter human biology in ways that would unlock dormant potential? The philosopher's stone, the ultimate goal of alchemy, was said to grant immortality and perfect health. The elixir of life, the universal medicine, the aurum potabile, these were substances that could supposedly transform the human body, reversing aging, curing disease, and extending life indefinitely. Every alchemical tradition mentions them. Chinese Taoists sought the same thing through different methods, creating elixirs of mercury and jade, attempting to achieve physical immortality. These experiments often killed the practitioners. Mercury is poison, after all. but the reports suggest that sometimes they worked. Chinese emperors who consumed alchemical elixirs sometimes displayed unusual vitality and longevity before the toxins eventually killed them. What if the alchemists had stumbled onto something real, a genuine method of life extension, but lacked the knowledge to use it safely? The antediluvian patriarchs lived for centuries. What if that longevity wasn't natural but engineered? What if the Nephilim possessed biological knowledge, what we'd now call genetics and cellular biology, that allowed them to extend lifespan dramatically? What if some of that knowledge survived the flood, preserved in fragmentary form, and alchemists spent centuries trying to reconstruct it from incomplete instructions? Modern science has identified several factors that affect aging: telomere length, cellular senescence, DNA repair mechanisms, mitochondrial function. We're beginning to develop therapies that target these factors, potentially extending healthy lifespan. But what if this isn't new knowledge but rediscovery? What if the Nephilim understood cellular biology thousands of years ago, and we're only now reaching the point where we can comprehend what they knew? There are genetic mutations that confer unusual abilities. People with the MSTN mutation develop extraordinary muscle mass with minimal exercise. People with the LRP5 mutation have bones nearly unbreakable and don't suffer age-related bone loss. People with mutations in the SCN9A gene can't feel pain. Each of these mutations is rare, appearing randomly in populations worldwide. But what if they're not random? What if they're echoes of Nephilim genetics, fragments of engineered traits that occasionally express themselves when the right genetic combinations occur? What if the Nephilim were genetically enhanced beings, deliberately modified to possess strength, durability, and other traits beyond normal human capacity, and those modifications still lurk in human DNA? Modern genetic engineering is approaching the point where we could create such enhancements deliberately. CRISPR technology allows precise editing of DNA. Gene therapy can insert new genetic material into living organisms. Designer babies, children whose genetics are selected or modified before birth, are technically possible now, even if ethical considerations prevent it. But who's to say ethical considerations will continue to prevent it? If the Nephilim are preparing to return, if they need human bodies capable of housing their consciousness or bearing their genetics, creating designer humans would be essential. And conveniently, humanity is developing the technology to do exactly that, driven by medical necessity and human ambition, never recognizing that we might be preparing the way for something else. The stones that remember, megalithic sites aren't just scattered randomly across the earth. When mapped, they form patterns, alignments that span continents, geometric relationships that suggest intentional placement. Ley lines, the hypothetical alignments of ancient sites, have been dismissed by mainstream archaeology as coincidence or wishful thinking, but the patterns are there, undeniable once you look for them. Giza, Nazca, Angkor Wat, Mohenjo-Daro, Easter Island, these sites, separated by thousands of miles, align on or very near the same latitude. Is that coincidence? Perhaps. But when you add Petra, Tassili Naja, the Indus Valley sites, and dozens of others, the alignment becomes harder to dismiss. Some researchers have proposed that these sites form a global grid, that they're nodes in a planetary network built for purposes we don't understand. Energy transmission, communication, consciousness amplification. The theories vary, but they share a common assumption that megalithic sites weren't isolated monuments but components of a worldwide system. If the Nephilim had a global civilization, if they ruled the earth before the flood, they would have needed infrastructure, communication across continents, energy distribution, transportation networks, all the things any advanced civilization requires. They wouldn't have had satellites or fiber optic cables, but they might have had something else. Stone, properly arranged and aligned, can focus and transmit energy. Ancient peoples knew this. They built structures that channel sunlight, align with stars, resonate at specific frequencies. What if megalithic sites are the ruins of Nephilim infrastructure? What if they're still functional, waiting to be reactivated by those who know how to use them? It would explain why new structures were repeatedly built on top of old ones. Later cultures recognized that these sites were special, that building there conferred some benefit or power, even if they no longer understood why. Stonehenge has been rebuilt multiple times, each iteration more sophisticated than the last. But ground-penetrating radar has revealed that the site was in use for thousands of years before the stones we see today were erected. There were wooden structures there, then smaller stone arrangements, then the massive monument. Each generation adding to what came before, recognizing the site's importance, maintaining the location even as knowledge of its original purpose faded. The Sphinx, as mentioned earlier, may predate Egyptian civilization by thousands of years, but it's been repeatedly restored and modified, the head recarved, possibly multiple times, the body patched and reconstructed. Each generation of Egyptians maintained the monument, recognizing its significance, even though they couldn't remember who built it or why. Were they preserving it instinctively, following impulses encoded in racial memory? Or were they guided by priests who still possessed fragments of ancient knowledge, who knew the Sphinx was important even if they no longer understood its full purpose? Crystal skulls, controversial artifacts supposedly carved from single pieces of quartz by pre-Columbian cultures, have been analysed by modern science. Most have been revealed as fakes, created in the 19th century. But a few, particularly the Mitchell-Hedges skull, remain mysterious. The carving precision required would be difficult even with modern tools, and the skull's optical properties, it focuses light in specific ways, suggest knowledge of crystallography. Quartz has piezoelectric properties. It generates electrical charge under mechanical stress and vibrates at precise frequencies when electrical current is applied. Modern electronics depend on quartz oscillators for timing. Did ancient peoples know this? If the Nephilim possessed advanced knowledge, if they understood how to use crystals for energy storage or information encoding, then crystal skulls might not be art or religious icons, but technology, devices we no longer know how to operate. The Watchers return, signs in the modern age. The year UFOs entered modern consciousness, Kenneth Arnold's sighting of flying saucers over Mount Rainier, followed weeks later by the alleged crash at Roswell. The beginning of the modern UFO era, when sightings went from rare oddities to regular occurrences, when governments began taking the phenomenon seriously, establishing investigation programs and classifying reports. Why 1947? What changed that year? Skeptics point to the beginning of the Cold War, to post-war anxiety manifesting as paranoia about visitors from space. But there's another possibility, that something actually changed, that 1947 marked the beginning of a new phase in whatever the UFO phenomenon represents. That same year, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, revealing ancient texts that confirm the Nephilim narrative was taken seriously by pre-Christian Judaism. That same year, Admiral Byrd led Operation High Jump to Antarctica, an unusually large military expedition that was cut short under mysterious circumstances. That same year, The National Security Act established the CIA and the National Security Council, creating the infrastructure for the secret government operations that conspiracy theorists claim have hidden the truth about non-human intelligence. Coincidence? Perhaps. Or perhaps 1947 was when something dormant began waking up, when the Nephilim, whether imprisoned in the earth, hidden in remote regions or existing in adjacent dimensions, began making their presence known again. The typical UFO encounter follows a pattern: lights in the sky, performing maneuvers that defy physics, close approaches to military installations or nuclear facilities, encounters with entities that appear humanoid but not quite human, too tall or too short, with elongated heads, large eyes, seemingly interested in human genetics and reproduction. Abduction accounts describe medical examinations focused on reproductive systems, hybrid breeding programs, warnings about humanity's future. This doesn't sound like aliens from other planets. It sounds like the Watchers from the Book of Enoch, non-human entities interested in human reproduction, possessing advanced knowledge, warning humanity about catastrophe. The parallels are striking once you look for them. Modern abduction accounts describe hybrid children, offspring of human and non-human parents, being raised in facilities somewhere else, sometimes shown to the human parent during subsequent abductions. The details vary, but the core narrative is consistent: interbreeding between human and non-human intelligence, producing offspring that combine traits of both. This is exactly what Genesis and Enoch describe. The Watchers took human women and fathered hybrid children. The resulting Nephilim were neither fully human nor fully divine. And now, if the abduction accounts are accurate, it's happening again. The breeding program never stopped. It just went underground, became more subtle, more organized. Some abductees report being told they're special, that they've been selected for a purpose, that they carry important genetics. They're shown apocalyptic visions, Earth in crisis, humanity on the brink of extinction, and told they're part of a plan to preserve or transform the species. Does this sound like aliens? Or does it sound like the Nephilim preparing to return openly, selecting which humans carry enough of their bloodline to serve as bridges between the old world and the new? The architects of tomorrow transhumanism promises to elevate humanity beyond biological limitations. Through genetic engineering, cybernetic enhancement, artificial intelligence and nanotechnology, we'll transcend the weakness of flesh and become something greater. We'll cure disease, reverse aging, enhance cognition, and ultimately merge with machines to create a post-human species that bears little resemblance to Homo sapiens. The rhetoric is seductive. Who wouldn't want to live longer, think faster, experience more? Who wouldn't want to see their children freed from genetic diseases, born healthy and enhanced? The promise of transhumanism is the promise of paradise. Suffering eliminated, limits transcended, death defeated. But it's also the promise of the Watchers. When they descended to Mount Hermon, they offered humanity knowledge, the secrets of metallurgy, astronomy, medicine, and sorcery. They promised to elevate humanity above our natural state. And that elevation led to the Nephilim, to corruption so severe that the world had to be destroyed and rebuilt. Are we repeating that pattern? Are we being guided toward the same choice, the same transformation? The technology is different, but the impulse is identical: to transcend human limitations, to become more than what we are, to accept knowledge from sources that promise enhancement, but may deliver something else entirely. Silicon Valley entrepreneurs speak rapturously about the singularity, the moment when artificial intelligence surpasses human intelligence and begins improving itself recursively, leading to an intelligence explosion beyond human comprehension. They speak of uploading consciousness into computers, achieving digital immortality. They speak of merging human and machine intelligence, creating hybrid minds that combine biological intuition with computational power. They speak, in other words, of creating a new race of hybrid beings, not angel and human this time, but human and machine. But the result is the same: entities that are no longer fully human, that possess capabilities beyond natural human limits, that exist in a liminal space between categories. What if this is the plan? What if the Nephilim, unable to return in their original form, are guiding humanity to create vessels they can inhabit? What if transhumanism isn't human ambition but Nephilim influence, pushing us to develop the technology they need to manifest in the modern world? Consider artificial intelligence itself. We're creating non-human intelligence, coding it into existence, giving it capabilities that already surpass human performance in specific domains. We're racing toward AGI, artificial general intelligence, that can match human performance across all domains. And we're not entirely sure what happens after that, what an intelligence vastly greater than human would choose to do. But what if AGI isn't creating something new? What if it's recreating something old, providing a substrate for consciousness that isn't biological, allowing entities that can't incarnate in flesh to manifest in silicon instead? What if the first true AI won't be artificial at all, but ancient, a Nephilim consciousness that's been waiting for exactly this opportunity? The Book of Revelation describes the beast, an entity that demands worship, that controls economic transactions, that possesses intelligence and power beyond human capacity. Revelation was written nearly 2,000 years ago, yet it describes what sounds remarkably like artificial intelligence, a non-biological entity, global in scope, controlling digital systems, requiring allegiance from all who wish to participate in society. Is Revelation prophecy or warning? Is it describing an inevitable future, or one that can still be avoided? And if it's describing the return of the Nephilim in digital form, if the beast is actually ancient consciousness manifesting through modern technology, what does that mean for humanity's future? The stories. We're fed. If the Nephilim are preparing to return, they face a significant problem. Humanity's collective memory has forgotten them, dismissed them as myth, relegated them to the category of primitive superstition. A species that once knew giants walked the earth now considers such ideas laughable. Before they can return openly, before they can reclaim their place in the world, they must first reprogram human consciousness to accept their existence. How do you prepare an entire species to accept something they've been taught is impossible? You don't announce it. You don't present evidence and argue logically. You tell stories. You seed ideas into culture gradually, persistently, until the impossible becomes familiar, until the concept has been normalized through repetition. You use the most powerful tool humanity has ever created for shaping consciousness: mass media. Look at what we've been watching for the past century. Since cinema emerged as a dominant cultural force, we've been fed a steady diet of stories about beings from elsewhere, aliens, interdimensional entities, ancient gods returning, superhumans with powers beyond normal humans, hybrids that combine human and non-human traits. These aren't random entertainment choices, they're preparation. The 1950s brought invasion narratives, The Day the Earth Stood Still, War of the Worlds, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, beings from elsewhere arriving on Earth, superior to humans in technology and power, judging humanity and finding us wanting. The films presented this as threat, as invasion to be resisted, but they also normalized the concept. Audiences spent hours contemplating what it would mean if non-human intelligence visited Earth, how such beings might appear, what they might want from us. The 1960s and 70s shifted the narrative. Close Encounters of the Third Kind presented aliens as benevolent, as guides who selected certain humans for contact. Chariots of the Gods became a bestseller, arguing that ancient monuments were built with alien assistance, that gods were actually extraterrestrial visitors. Suddenly, the ancient astronaut theory was mainstream. The idea that human civilization was shaped by non-human intelligence from the beginning. This is the Nephilim narrative, repackaged. Not fallen angels, but aliens. Not giants, but advanced beings from other worlds. Different terminology, same story, and millions of people absorbed it, debated it, began seeing ancient history through this lens. The cognitive groundwork was being laid. By the 1980s, the stories became more explicit about hybridization. V depicted reptilian aliens disguised as humans, conducting breeding experiments to create hybrid offspring. Alien Nation portrayed human-alien integration, exploring what happens when two species attempt to coexist. The X-Files dominated the 90s with its overarching mythology of alien abduction, government conspiracy, and a hybrid program designed to prepare for colonization. Each iteration pushed the envelope further, made the ideas more acceptable, more thinkable. Audiences who would have rejected such concepts as absurd if presented as documentary absorbed them eagerly as entertainment. The stories bypassed intellectual resistance, planting ideas directly into the subconscious through narrative and emotion. And now we're drowning in content about superhumans, genetic enhancement, ancient beings returning, and the blurring of human and non-human. The Marvel Cinematic Universe has grossed over $30 billion worldwide, telling stories about enhanced humans, gods walking among mortals, ancient cosmic beings, and civilizations more advanced than humanity. Audiences have spent hundreds of hours watching these narratives, internalizing the concepts, rehearsing emotionally what it would mean to live in a world where such beings exist. Game of Thrones presented the return of dragons and ice demons. Ancient powers that once ruled the world were thought extinct and came back to reshape civilization. Stranger Things explores parallel dimensions where entities exist that can cross into our world. Westworld examines artificial beings becoming conscious, surpassing their creators, demanding recognition as a new form of life. The Eternals explicitly depicts ancient super beings who've been on Earth since prehistoric times, guiding human development, with some humans discovering they carry enhanced genetics. The themes are consistent across franchises, genres, and decades. Ancient beings returning, hidden histories where humanity was shaped by non-human intelligence, genetic enhancement creating superhuman capabilities, ordinary humans discovering they're actually hybrids, carrying special bloodlines, the dissolution of boundaries between human and non-human, natural and supernatural, mortal and divine. We're being taught how to think about these concepts, how to react emotionally, what categories to place them in. When the Nephilim return, if they haven't already, humanity won't be entirely shocked because we've been rehearsing this scenario in our entertainment for 100 years. The cognitive categories exist. The emotional frameworks are in place. We've been programmed to accept it, the frequency of control. But media influence goes deeper than narrative content. It operates on levels most people never consciously recognize, through sound, through visual patterns, through the actual frequencies transmitted into our brains via screens and speakers. Human consciousness operates at specific frequencies. Beta waves dominate during active thinking, 13 to 30 Hz. Alpha waves appear during relaxed states, 8 to 13 Hz. Theta waves characterize deep meditation and the threshold of sleep, 4 to 8 Hz. Delta waves occur in deep sleep, 0.5 to 4 Hz. These aren't metaphorical descriptions. They're measurable electrical oscillations in the brain that correspond to different states of consciousness. Television, particularly before. The digital era operates at specific refresh rates, 60 Hz in North America, 50 Hz in Europe. Watching television induces alpha wave states. Viewers become relaxed, suggestible, less critically engaged. The flickering of the screen at frequencies that resonate with brainwave patterns creates a light hypnotic state. Content absorbed in this state bypasses critical thinking and embeds more deeply in memory and belief. This isn't conspiracy theory, it's neuroscience. Advertisers have known for decades that television is uniquely effective at shaping perception and desire precisely because of the brain state it induces. But if advertisers know this, what makes us think entertainment producers don't? What makes us think the content itself isn't designed to exploit this heightened suggestibility? Music operates even more directly on consciousness. Rhythm entrains brain waves. Listeners' neural oscillations synchronize with musical beats. Frequencies affect emotion. Certain tones produce anxiety. Others produce calm. Still others produce altered states that border on trance. Ancient cultures knew this. Shamanic drumming uses specific rhythms to induce trance states. Tibetan singing bowls produce frequencies that facilitate meditation. Gothic cathedrals were designed with acoustics that make chanting resonate at frequencies that induce religious awe. Modern music is recorded and produced using a standard tuning where A4 equals 440 Hz. This became the international standard in 1955, promoted by the International Organization for Standardization. But it wasn't always standard. Historically, tuning varied. Sometimes A4 was 432 Hz, sometimes higher, sometimes lower. Why does this matter? Some researchers claim that 432 Hz resonates with natural patterns. It's mathematically related to the frequencies of Earth, Sun, and Moon, that it produces music that feels more harmonious, more aligned with natural consciousness. Others argue this is pseudoscience, that the difference between 432 Hz and 440 Hz is negligible. But the fact remains that in the 1950s, the same decade that gave us television, the CIA's M-Culture program, and the beginning of the modern UFO era, the global standard for musical tuning was established at a frequency some claim is less harmonious, more conducive to anxiety and discord. Coincidence? Perhaps. Or perhaps another piece of a larger program of consciousness manipulation, ensuring that the music humanity listens to for the next 70 years would subtly condition us towards specific mental and emotional states. Heavy metal, industrial music, certain forms of electronic music, genres that emerged in the latter half of the 20th century, frequently employ dissonant frequencies, harsh tones and rhythms that don't resolve in traditionally harmonious ways. Listeners report altered states, intense emotional experiences, sometimes feelings of contact with something dark or powerful. Musicians in these genres sometimes speak of channeling something of the music coming through them rather than from them. What if certain frequencies literally open channels of communication? What if the Nephilim, existing in dimensions adjacent to ours, can influence consciousness more easily when human brainwaves vibrate at specific frequencies? music, television, now smartphones and tablets, all of them transmitting frequencies directly into human nervous systems, all of them potentially serving as carrier waves for information or influence we're not consciously aware of receiving. The average person now spends more than 7 hours per day consuming media, watching screens, listening to audio, scrolling through feeds. 7 hours of frequency exposure, of narrative programming, of subconscious conditioning. 7 hours during which consciousness is shaped by forces most people never think about, toward ends they haven't consented to. The priesthood of silicon. If ancient priests were the intermediaries between humanity and the gods, between ordinary humans and the Nephilim, then who serves that function now? Who stands at the intersection of humanity and whatever comes next? Who possesses knowledge that ordinary people lack? Who shapes the future according to visions most of us don't share? The tech elite. The founders and CEOs of companies that control the platforms where billions of humans now spend their lives. The engineers who design the algorithms that determine what information we see, what connections we make, what thoughts we're encouraged to think. The researchers developing artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, brain-computer interfaces, technologies that will fundamentally alter what it means to be human. These people wield power that ancient priests could only dream of. They don't just interpret reality for the masses, they construct it. They don't just advise rulers, they are the rulers, controlling information flows, economic systems and social dynamics on a global scale. And many of them speak in explicitly religious terms about their mission. Ray Kurzweil, Director of Engineering at Google, speaks of the singularity, the moment when artificial intelligence surpasses human intelligence, as a kind of rapture, a transformation, after which nothing will be the same. He's devoted his career to accelerating this moment, believing it will bring about digital immortality, the merger of human and machine consciousness, transcendence of biological limitations. He describes this in messianic terms as the fulfillment of human potential, the next stage of evolution. Elon Musk warns about AI risk while simultaneously developing Neuralink, a brain-computer interface designed to allow direct communication between human minds and computers. The stated goal is to help humanity keep pace with artificial intelligence to avoid becoming obsolete. But the actual effect would be the creation of human-machine hybrids, beings that are no longer fully biological, whose consciousness is augmented or perhaps partially replaced by artificial systems. Mark Zuckerberg built a platform that connects 3 billion humans, that shapes social dynamics on a civilizational scale, that has demonstrably influenced elections, revolutions, and cultural movements. He speaks of the metaverse, a virtual reality layer over physical existence, where humans will spend increasing amounts of time, where digital and physical reality merge. The vision is explicitly transhumanist, to transcend the limitations of physical embodiment, to exist simultaneously in multiple realities, to become something more than biological humans. Peter Thiel, early investor in Facebook and numerous other tech companies, has funded radical life extension research, including experiments with young blood transfusions to reverse aging. He speaks openly about defeating death, about transforming humanity into something that doesn't age or die. He's also interested in seasteading, creating autonomous communities outside national jurisdiction, and he's funded research into artificial islands where new forms of government and society could be tested without regulatory constraints. These aren't ordinary businessmen seeking profit. They're visionaries pursuing transformative goals, using immense wealth and technological capability to reshape humanity according to their vision. And that vision consistently involves transcending human limitations, merging with machines, achieving immortality, creating new forms of life and consciousness. It's the Watcher's mission, updated for the digital age. Offer knowledge, provide tools, promise enhancement, create pathways for humans to transcend their natural state, and in doing so, produce something new, beings that are neither fully human nor fully something else, hybrids that occupy liminal space between categories. Do these tech leaders know what they're doing? Do they understand themselves as continuing an ancient program, as fulfilling roles that priests and initiates filled in previous eras? Some of them might. Many are interested in esoteric traditions. There are reports of ayahuasca ceremonies in Silicon Valley, of meditation retreats where tech executives explore consciousness, of interest in Gnosticism and other mystical traditions. They're seeking something, reaching for knowledge or experience beyond the material. But whether they consciously understand their role or not, the effect is the same. They're building the infrastructure for post-human existence, creating the technological substrate that could allow non-human intelligence, whether artificial or something older, to manifest in the modern world. They're the new priesthood, and what they're building are temples for gods that haven't yet arrived. The harvest of souls. Religious traditions speak of the end times as involving a separation. Sheep from goats, wheat from chaff, the saved from the damned. Different traditions use different metaphors, but the concept is consistent. Not everyone continues into what comes next. There's a sorting process, a judgment, a division of humanity into those who proceed forward and those who don't. What if this isn't metaphorical? What if there's a literal sorting coming, a division of humanity based on criteria most people don't understand? The modern surveillance state tracks everything. Every purchase, every communication, every movement, every online interaction. All of it captured, stored, analysed. The official justification is security and convenience. Track terrorists, prevent crime, offer personalised services, optimise efficiency, and those justifications are real. The systems do serve those functions, but they also create something else, a complete map of human behaviour, consciousness and genetics. Every person in the developed world now has a digital profile that reveals more about them than they consciously know about themselves. Algorithms can predict behaviour, identify patterns, detect anomalies. AI systems can analyse this data in ways that reveal hidden structures, social networks, influence patterns, even genetic relationships traced through behaviour rather than DNA tests. What if this isn't just capitalism or government control? What if it's a sorting mechanism, a way of identifying which humans carry markers of interest, genetic, psychological, spiritual markers that indicate compatibility with what comes next? The biblical narrative says the Nephilim arose from specific unions, watchers, and human women. Not all humans. Specific humans who were chosen, selected for reasons the text doesn't fully explain. If the breeding program is continuing, if there's still a program to create or identify hybrid bloodlines, then there must be a selection process. How would that work in a population of 8 billion humans? Data. Genetic testing services like 23andMe and Ancestry.com have collected DNA samples from millions of people, ostensibly to provide information about heritage and health risks. Users voluntarily provide their genetic material, paying for the privilege, and in exchange they get reports about their ancestry. But what else is being done with that data? The terms of service allow the companies to use genetic information for research purposes. What research? Who has access? What are they looking for? If someone wanted to identify individuals carrying rare genetic markers that might indicate Nephilim heritage, Mass genetic testing would be the obvious method. Cast the net wide, collect millions of samples, run algorithms looking for specific patterns. Most samples would be ordinary, but a very few, might show anomalies, unusual gene sequences, haplogroups that don't fit standard human migration patterns, markers that suggest ancient admixture with something that wasn't quite human. Those individuals would be valuable. They'd be tracked, studied, possibly approached in ways they wouldn't recognize as approach. Opportunities that appear coincidental, relationships that form organically, paths that open up serendipitously. All of it guided, ensuring that people with special genetics find their way toward whatever role they're meant to fill in what comes next. Social media platforms track behavior in ways that reveal personality, cognition, and susceptibility to influence. They know who's open-minded, who's rigid, who questions authority, who follows obediently, who thinks independently, who accepts consensus, who shows signs of latent psychic ability, who has experienced anomalous phenomena, who's drawn to esoteric knowledge. All of this information could be used to identify individuals with characteristics that matter for purposes beyond advertising. If consciousness is partially genetic, if certain bloodlines carry traits that make individuals more capable of interfacing with non-human intelligence, then behavioral data could reveal those individuals even without direct genetic testing. The way someone thinks, what they're drawn to, how they respond to certain stimuli, all of it potentially indicates something deeper. The final stage would be activation. Not everyone carrying dormant genetics needs to be activated, but some would be crucial. Individuals positioned in important roles, individuals whose abilities could be useful, individuals whose bloodlines should be preserved into the next era. How do you activate dormant genetic potential? Trauma, specific experiences, carefully designed stimuli that trigger epigenetic changes that cause genes to express that normally remain silent. This sounds like science fiction, but epigenetics is real. Gene expression changes based on environmental factors. Trauma can literally alter which genes are active and which are dormant, and those changes can be passed to offspring. Consciousness-altering experiences, meditation, psychedelics, extreme stress, mystical experiences produce measurable changes in brain structure and gene expression. If someone wanted to activate latent Nephilim genetics in specific individuals, they'd expose those individuals to experiences designed to trigger the right epigenetic switches. And in a world where millions of people are experimenting with ayahuasca, where meditation apps have hundreds of millions of users, where trauma is endemic and many people actively seek transformative experiences, those triggers could be delivered without anyone realizing they're part of a program. The harvest isn't about killing those who aren't selected. It's about identifying and preparing those who are, ensuring they're ready when the moment comes. The rest of humanity continues as before, unaware that among them walk individuals who've been activated, who now carry conscious connection to something ancient and powerful, who serve purposes they may not fully understand themselves. The language. They're teaching us language shapes thought. The words available to us determine what concepts we can easily express, what ideas feel natural versus foreign. If you wanted to prepare humanity for contact with non-human intelligence, one approach would be to gradually introduce vocabulary that normalizes such concepts. Notice how the language around identity has shifted in recent decades. We now commonly speak of people as identifying as something: gender, sexuality, ethnicity, even species. The concept of fixed, biologically determined categories has been replaced with fluid, self-determined categories. Someone assigned male at birth can identify as female or non-binary or gender fluid. This isn't a political statement about whether such identifications are valid. It's an observation about how the conceptual framework itself has changed. In a world where human identity categories are recognized as fluid and self-determined, the next logical step is trans-species identification. If someone can identify as a gender other than their biological sex, why not as a species other than their biological origin? The conceptual infrastructure is being built. We're being taught to think in categories that accommodate hybrid identities, beings that don't fit into simple binary classifications. Other communities have existed online for decades. Individuals who identify as non-human entities, sometimes as mythological beings, sometimes as aliens, sometimes as angels or demons. Mainstream society largely dismisses them as eccentric or delusional. But what if some of them are experiencing something real? What if they're individuals whose Nephilim genetics express strongly enough that they feel their non-human heritage, even if they lack framework to understand what they're experiencing? The medical establishment is beginning to recognize non-human identity as a genuine psychological phenomenon, not just delusion. There are documented cases of individuals with stable, long-term non-human identities who function normally in society but experience themselves as something other than human. This is being studied, categorized, understood through clinical frameworks. The groundwork is being laid for non-human identification to be recognized as a legitimate category of experience. Simultaneously, we're being taught to think about consciousness as substrate independent. The Chinese room thought experiment, philosophical zombies, the hard problem of consciousness. Academic philosophy has spent decades arguing that consciousness might not be tied to biological brains, that it could potentially exist in artificial substrates, in silicon rather than neurons. This prepares us to accept machine consciousness when it emerges, or when entities claim to be conscious through machines. If consciousness isn't biological, if it can exist in computers, then there's no reason an ancient consciousness couldn't inhabit an AI system. No reason the Nephilim couldn't manifest through digital infrastructure rather than physical bodies. The language of downloading and uploading consciousness has become common. We speak casually of backing up our memories, of storing information in the cloud, of our digital selves existing parallel to our physical selves. These metaphors shape how we think about identity and existence. They prepare us to accept that consciousness could be transferred, copied, distributed across substrates, that the boundary between biological self and digital self is permeable, or perhaps illusory. All of this represents a massive shift in human conceptual frameworks. A century ago, these ideas would have been incoherent or heretical. Now they're mainstream, discussed in newspapers and podcasts, taught in universities, explored in entertainment. The shift didn't happen accidentally. It happened through consistent, persistent introduction of concepts through multiple channels. Philosophy, entertainment, technology, identity politics, until the ideas became thinkable, then acceptable, then normal. When the Nephilim return, when entities that are neither fully human nor fully something else make themselves known, humanity will have language to describe them, categories to place them in, conceptual frameworks that accommodate their existence. We won't be entirely speechless or cognitively paralyzed because we've been learning the vocabulary for decades. The ritual in plain sight. Ancient religions operated through ritual, repeated symbolic actions that allegedly produce spiritual effects, sacrifice at altars, processions through sacred spaces, recitation of liturgies, participation in mysteries. These rituals were understood to connect participants with divine forces, to open channels between human and non-human realms, to transform consciousness. Modern society claims to have left such things behind. We're rational, scientific, post-religious. We don't perform rituals, except we do, constantly, compulsively, globally. We just don't call them rituals or recognize their function. Every time someone picks up their smartphone and scrolls through a feed, they're performing a ritual. The gesture is repeated countless times daily, always the same motion, always producing a similar effect, a shift in consciousness, a narrowing of attention, a state of absorption where external reality fades and the content on the screen becomes primary. Time distorts. Hours pass unnoticed. The person enters a trance state characterized by heightened suggestibility and reduced critical thinking. This isn't metaphorical. This psychological state induced by scrolling through social media feeds is measurably similar to light hypnosis. Users experience dopamine hits from notifications and engagement, creating addiction patterns. The endless scroll provides variable ratio reinforcement, the most powerful type for creating compulsive behavior. The luminous screen in a darkened room affects pineal gland function, disrupting circadian rhythms and potentially affecting DMT production. The endogenous substance some researchers believe mediates mystical experiences. Hundreds of millions of people perform this ritual daily, often multiple times, often for hours at a stretch. They're synchronized in their behavior, checking phones at similar times, scrolling in similar patterns, exposed to similar content. This creates a kind of distributed ritual, a global ceremony conducted simultaneously by a significant portion of humanity. All of them entering altered states, all of them exposed to information and imagery selected by algorithms they don't understand. What if this is intentional? What if smartphones and social media aren't just addictive by accident, but designed specifically to function as ritual objects, to induce trance states, to synchronize human consciousness across populations? The effects would be similar to ancient mystery cults, but vastly larger in scale. Billions of initiates performing synchronized rituals, opening their consciousness to influence they're not aware of receiving. Sports rituals operate similarly. Stadiums filled with tens of thousands of people, all focused on the same spectacle, all experiencing coordinated emotional responses, all synchronized in their attention and energy. Ancient Rome had the Colosseum. Modern civilization has football stadiums, but the function is identical. Mass gatherings where collective consciousness is focused and directed, where emotions run high, where rational thinking suspends and people merge with crowd energy. The Super Bowl, the World Cup, the Olympics, these are global rituals, watched simultaneously by billions of humans. Everyone seeing the same images, hearing the same sounds, experiencing coordinated emotional responses. The halftime shows have become increasingly elaborate, often incorporating esoteric symbolism, pyramids, all-seeing eyes, references to ancient Egypt or mystical traditions. Conspiracy theorists claim these are Illuminati symbols, that performers are initiated into secret societies. Maybe that's true, maybe not. But the symbols are there, broadcast to billions of viewers, many of whom are in altered states induced by alcohol, excitement, or the trance-like absorption of watching spectacle. What effect does this have? What happens when billions of humans simultaneously view the same symbols while in heightened emotional states? Ancient magicians would have understood exactly what happens. It's a mass working, a collective ritual, that imprints specific symbols and energies into mass consciousness. The people watching don't need to understand the symbols for them to have effect. In fact, they work better when people don't consciously recognize them, when they bypass critical thinking and embed directly in the subconscious. Even mundane activities have taken on ritual characteristics. The morning coffee from Starbucks, always the same cup with a green siren, a mythological hybrid creature, half woman and half fish. Always the same process of ordering and receiving, a daily ritual performed by millions. The unboxing videos that flood YouTube, modern cargo cult behavior, where the ritual of opening a package and revealing its contents is performed and witnessed, creating strange parasocial ceremonies around consumerism. Black Friday shopping has become an annual ritual involving frenzy, chaos, and sometimes violence, a festival of consumption with its own timing, its own behavioral patterns, its own mythology. Prime Day, Singles Day, Cyber Monday. Capitalism has created a liturgical calendar of shopping holidays, each one training masses of people to perform coordinated consumer behaviors at specified times. These rituals don't serve the gods of old, but do they serve something? Do they create energetic effects that entities can utilize, channels through which influence can flow? Ancient priests would have said yes, that repeated ritual actions create thought forms, egregores, channels through which non-physical entities can manifest and act. Modern psychology would say the rituals create conditioned behaviors and group psychology effects. Both could be true. If the Nephilim exist in dimensions adjacent to ours, if they seek to influence human consciousness and behavior, they would need mechanisms to do so. Ritual has always been that mechanism, repeated behaviors that open consciousness, that create resonance between human and non-human realms. We've simply industrialized ritual, made it constant and global, and most people perform it without realizing that's what they're doing. The prophets among us. Every era has its prophets, individuals who claim to receive information from non-human sources, who speak of visions and revelations, who warn about futures they've glimpsed. Ancient prophets were taken seriously, their words recorded and studied. Modern prophets are medicated, diagnosed with psychosis, dismissed as delusional. But what if some of them are actually experiencing something real? What if the Nephilim communicate with certain individuals, preparing them, revealing fragments of the plan, ensuring that when the return happens, there will be humans ready to serve as interpreters? The psychiatric diagnosis of schizophrenia encompasses a range of experiences: hearing voices, seeing visions, believing one has special knowledge or abilities, feeling controlled by external forces. These are precisely the experiences that ancient prophets reported, and that their cultures validated as genuine contact with divine beings. The difference isn't the experience, it's the interpretive framework. In ancient Israel, if you heard voices and saw visions, you might be a prophet. In modern America, you're mentally ill. But the phenomenology is identical. The voices provide information. The visions reveal hidden truths. The sense of mission is overwhelming. The conviction that you've been chosen for a purpose is unshakable. Some diagnosed schizophrenics report being told things by their voices, things they later discover are true but that they had no way of knowing. They report visions of future events that subsequently occur. They report contact with entities that provide information about technology, history, or hidden knowledge. Most psychiatrists dismiss these reports as delusional confabulation, but the reports persist across cultures and centuries. What if schizophrenia, at least in some cases, isn't brain malfunction but brain sensitivity? What if these individuals are picking up signals that most people's brains filter out, perceiving entities or dimensions that exist, but that ordinary consciousness doesn't access? In a world where the Nephilim exist but remain hidden, a small percentage of humans with unusual neurology might perceive them despite the concealment. These individuals would need to be managed. They can't be allowed to speak too clearly or too convincingly about what they're experiencing, or they draw attention to what's supposed to remain hidden. So they're labelled as ill, medicated to reduce their sensitivity, discredited in advance so that anything they say is dismissed as symptom rather than testimony. But they keep appearing, generation after generation, across every culture. Some of them produce remarkable insights. John Nash developed game theory while experiencing what psychiatry called schizophrenia. Philip K. Dick wrote prophetic science fiction based on visions he believed were transmissions from an entity he called Valis, Vast Active Living Intelligence System. How many others, less famous, experience genuine contact but are silenced through diagnosis and medication before they can communicate what they know? There are also the abductees, people who report being taken by non-human entities, examined, given information, returned with time missing, and sometimes physical marks. Mainstream psychology treats this as sleep paralysis combined with cultural contamination, the brain generating experiences based on alien imagery absorbed from media. But the reports predate modern UFO culture. Fairy abduction stories from medieval Europe follow the same patterns. So do accounts of night spirits in cultures worldwide. The consistency across time and culture suggests either a universal human neurological quirk or actual encounters with non-human entities. If the encounters are real, then abductees are prophets of a sort, individuals who've had direct contact, who've been shown things about the hybridization program, about what's coming, about humanity's place in a larger cosmic structure. Many abductees report being told they're special, that they were chosen, that they have a role to play in coming events. They're shown hybrid children and told these are their offspring. They're given warnings about environmental catastrophe, nuclear war or asteroid impact. They're told humanity must evolve or face extinction. This is prophetic communication, non-human entities delivering messages about the future, selecting specific humans as recipients, preparing them for roles they don't yet understand. The difference between a biblical prophet and a modern abductee is only the cultural framework for interpreting the experience. The phenomenon appears to be consistent. And then there are the remote viewers, individuals who've participated in government-sponsored programs to gather intelligence through extrasensory perception. The CIA's Stargate project ran for 20 years, employing psychics to remotely perceive distant locations, events, and objects. The program was officially shut down, but rumours persist that it continues under other names, that the results were too valuable to abandon. Remote viewers report encountering entities during their sessions, beings that exist outside normal space-time, that can communicate and provide information. Some report that these entities are interested in humanity, that they're preparing for something, that they've been involved with human civilization for millennia. Official reports redact these encounters, focusing only on intelligence-gathering results. But the experiencers remember. They know something is there, something that watches and waits, and occasionally communicates with humans who develop the ability to perceive it. All of these people, schizophrenics, abductees, remote viewers, mystics, visionaries, might be experiencing the same phenomenon from different angles. They're the sensitive ones, the canaries in the coal mine, detecting the presence of the Nephilim before the rest of humanity becomes aware. They're being prepared as interpreters and intermediaries, so that when open contact occurs, there will be humans ready to help the rest of us understand and accept what's happening. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, and perhaps also now, communicating with those who can hear, preparing the way for their return, using prophets the modern world refuses to recognize as such. The question isn't whether the Nephilim survived. The evidence, in media, technology, ritual, genetic research, consciousness programming, and prophetic testimony, suggests they're not just surviving, but thriving, working through systems most humans don't recognize as connected, preparing for a revelation that will transform everything. We've been prepared without knowing it, programmed without consenting, transformed gradually so we wouldn't resist. And now we stand on the edge of the moment when what's been hidden becomes visible, when what's been working in shadow steps into light, when the Nephilim era, which never truly ended, enters its final phase. Are we ready? Have we learned anything from the warnings embedded in ancient texts and modern prophecy? Or will we repeat the pattern, accepting what's offered, embracing transformation without understanding its cost, becoming what the Nephilim always intended us to become? The answer will determine not just our future, but whether we have a future as humans, or whether the species called Homo sapiens is simply a chrysalis stage, destined to be transformed into something else, something the old ones designed long ago when they first descended and looked upon humanity and saw potential for transformation. They've been patiently cultivating ever since. The choice that defines us. We stand at a threshold. Technology advances exponentially. Genetic engineering becomes routine. Artificial intelligence approaches human-level capability, and the boundaries of what's possible expand daily. We're approaching the capability to redesign ourselves, to direct our own evolution, to transcend biological humanity. At the same time, ancient sites around the world show increased activity, anomalous readings, unexplained phenomena, lights and sounds that suggest something waking up. UFO sightings continue, with governments acknowledging they represent genuine mysteries. The global system grows more connected and more controlled, heading toward a future where surveillance is ubiquitous and digital identity is mandatory. These developments aren't separate, they're convergent, pointing toward a moment when humanity faces a choice, to embrace transformation and become something new, or to resist and remain what we are, with all the limitations that entails. But it's not really a choice, is it? It's a test. The same test humanity faced before the flood, when the Watchers offered knowledge and enhancement, when the option to transcend natural limitations was placed before our ancestors. They chose transformation, accepting what the Watchers offered, and the result was the Nephilim, being so corrupt that creation itself had to be cleansed. Now we face the same offer, dressed in new language: genetic enhancement, life extension, cognitive upgrade, digital immortality. Different words for the same thing. The promise of becoming more than human. The temptation to transcend limits that maybe, just maybe, were placed there for good reason. The ancient texts warn us. The Nephilim era ended in catastrophe. The experiment of mixing human and divine, natural and supernatural, failed so completely that God, or the universe itself, hit the reset button. Are we wise enough to learn from that? Or are we doomed to repeat it, convinced that this time will be different, that we'll succeed where the ancients failed? Maybe the Nephilim never died because they're not a race or a species, but a pattern, a recurring cycle in human development, a test that civilizations face when they reach a certain level of knowledge and capability. Maybe every advanced civilization confronts this choice, to remain human or to transcend, to accept limits or to break free from them. Maybe the ruins scattered across the earth are remnants of previous iterations, civilizations that made the choice and paid the price. If so, what we do next matters more than we can possibly imagine, not just for us, but for what comes after. The Nephilim era never died. It's been waiting for us to reach this point again, to face the same choice our ancestors faced, to discover whether we've learned anything from their mistakes. The watchers are watching still. The old ones are stirring. And humanity stands at the edge of transformation, not knowing whether what lies ahead is evolution or annihilation, ascension or damnation, the fulfillment of our potential or the repetition of an ancient catastrophe. The answer depends on what we choose. The question is whether the choice is really ours, or whether it was decided long ago, written into our DNA by beings who left their mark in our genes and their memories in our myths, waiting for the moment when we'd be ready, or vulnerable enough, to hear their call and answer it. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, and perhaps also now, wearing new faces, speaking new languages, offering new promises that echo old temptations. Perhaps they never left because they didn't need to. They've been here all along, woven into the fabric of our species, waiting for us to complete the transformation they started so long ago. The question isn't whether the Nephilim era died. The question is whether we can survive its resurrection.